Hello, and welcome to another watercolor tutorial with me, Tessa, where we will be building off my last video on how to draw an eye with how to paint one in a semi-realistic style. This won't be about the basics of painting with watercolor, but I'll explain my process and the stages I would go through to paint an eye in this style. Materials-wise, you will need brushes. I have a selection of different sizes here, and you will also, of course, need your paints. I will be using my Winsor & Newton Professional half-pan palette, and you will, of course, also want a surface to paint on, as well as some clean water and a rag or a cloth to clean your brushes on. Jumping straight in, I like to start off my paintings with a very loose underlayer. I think this shows off the quality of watercolours and helps keep that loose look throughout. It also makes the page less blank to start with, which can help take off some of the pressure. At the beginning, I'm focusing on mapping out my colours rather than thinking about details. So here I'm using yellow ochre to map out the yellow tones, followed by a mix of reds and browns. The reference I'm using is this one here, and you'll notice throughout a lot of this that I'm not using a single colour, and I'm mixing a lot in the palette. When trying to create skin tones, I find this helps to make everything a little bit more cohesive, but avoids muddying the colours by mixing it on the paper. I'm then starting to mix in some purples, subdued by browns again, to define those thinner areas of the skin. You'll notice that the under eye is a lot more purple or even blue than the rest of the skin around the eye, because this is where it's thinnest. And understanding a little bit about face anatomy can definitely help with your colour choices. Finally, but very importantly at this stage, I'm shading the eye. And one of the biggest mistakes I see people make is making the white of the eye or the sclera actually white or just too light. In most instances, it actually has a lot of shadow over it, and so it's something that I like to establish early on so I don't kind of forget about it and make it fall out of line with the rest of the painting. Now that I have my first very thin layer of colour down, I can start to build up some depth. And I like to do this wet on wet because again, it helps to retain some of the very individual qualities of watercolours, like blooms and sometimes granulation. And again, it helps me not to get bogged down in the details at this early stage. For the sake of this video, I've sped this up quite a lot, and I did accidentally skip out a little bit too, but I've sped it up because adding layers takes a lot of time, especially when you're doing it as thin as I am here. I've also switched to a smaller brush. I started off with the size 3 mop brush and have moved down to a size 0 round, both from Paulina Bright, who I am an ambassador for. You can see at this stage I've added multiple layers of the same mix of colours, so we've got the yellows, the reds and the purple tones, all subdued a little bit with brown and perhaps a little bit of neutral tint, but we're starting to see some more realistic skin tones appear. And you'll notice how I jump around the page, not focusing on one area for too long, and this is because I'm working with the water and trying to choose the exact moment where it's dry enough or wet enough to get the effect I want. And sometimes that doesn't always work. Normally if I leave it a little bit too long and it's drier than anticipated, then you'll see some lifting, but I can fix that, that's not too much of an issue. And I do at this stage start to add in some more pigmented, more saturated colours where I really want them highlighted, like the yellow in the corner of the eye. Zooming in slightly, I can start to work on the iris and the pupil. Now if you know how I paint, you'll know that this is not what my eyes usually look like. 1, I don't usually paint in natural colours, and 2, I often don't show a defined pupil in the way I will do here. So to me, especially when painting blue eyes where it stands out a little bit more, it can look a little bit stark, a little bit harsh. So this is where softening the edges of the iris really helps to create a more natural look. And again, you want to be working in layers, building up depth and texture rather than just jumping straight in with your super saturated colour. It's also important to note how the watercolour is drying and how it gets lighter as it does so. You might find yourself having to go back over areas that you thought were good because they've lightened as they've dried. That is absolutely fine. You will need to do that at some points, and you'll see it again when we zoom back out. That is, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, just the nature of watercolour. Now that we've worked on the eye, when we look back at the rest of the surrounding painting, it looks pretty lacklustre in comparison. The depth of some of the shadows seems lessened, and some of the colours have become more muted. This is in part due to the watercolour lightening as it dries, like I mentioned before, but it's also due to the increased contrast now that the pupil has been added and the iris has been added. And so we need to go back and darken the surrounding area, just like we did before, by building more layers with lots of different colours. Again, I accidentally skipped over this bit, but it's just the exact same process as earlier where we were building the base tone of the skin. We've now got to a point where we can add details, these little nuanced changes that make it look more alive, as well as refine our shadows. Generally, I would recommend switching brushes around this point to something smaller, but if you stick with a larger brush, you might retain more of those painterly details, so it's up to you depending on what exact sort of finish you're looking for. Because in reality, the base is completed now, and you just need to add the final touches, although that can take a little bit longer than expected sometimes. For example, I'm adding a bit more colour to the inner of the bottom eyelid, where the skin meets the eyeball, as well as highlighting the depth of the eyelid by shading underneath it. And it's these little things that really bring the painting together. At this stage, our eye is looking rather bare, and next up we'll be adding the eyelashes. For this style, where we're going for semi-realism, we'll be adding the eyelashes individually. However, for a more painterly or expressive style, you might want to try adding them as more of a shadow or a smudge, rather than defining each individual one. You will also probably want to be using a smaller brush to paint them, and tapering the stroke, from wider and more pressure at the base, to thinner and lighter at the ends. This was mentioned in the How to Draw an Eye video, but you'll also want to pay attention to the angle of the lashes, and the way they curve. While they are dropping down relative to the level of the eye, they're also coming forwards as if out of the page, and so they'll cross over each other, and you want to make the length and the dynamics of them reflect that. Colour-wise, most natural lashes are more of a dark brown than a jet black, and using a true black for the lashes can make them look a little bit non-cohesive in most cases, but obviously it's going to depend on your reference photo and the exact eye that you're painting. And that goes for everything here. No two skin tones are the same, and you'll never use the exact same colour mixes or layering from painting to painting. Back to the angle of the lashes quickly, and when we're looking at the top lashes, you want to have some coming down across the eye, particularly in the inner and outer corners. If I'm honest, this isn't the best example, but just make sure you're painting what you can actually see in your reference and not what you think they look like. Moving on to pretty much the final stage of this painting, we'll now just be rounding out the composition with the eyebrow, following a similar technique to the eyelashes where we define most of the individual hairs, making sure to follow our reference photo. Personally, I tend to blend out the eyebrows a little more because I want the focus to be on the eye itself. And often when painting in my usual style, I'll use a couple of expressive brushstrokes rather than painting each individual hair. And I did go and do that after adding in the outlining hairs here, and in hindsight I could definitely have gone back over with a few more defining lines, but again, I want the eye to be the main focus. And that is our completed painting. Looking back at where we started, you can still see the initial watercolour layers that we put down right at the beginning, and we've maintained the look of the wet on wet watercolour and some of the blooms throughout, which I think really adds extra character to a painting. While editing this video, I definitely saw some things that I would improve on or go back to if I had the chance. Just small things like the top left of the iris is a little light, some of the eyelashes aren't quite right, and I'd probably add a few more layers of detail to the iris using a wet on dry technique. But overall, I'm pretty happy with this, and I hope it helps even just a little bit if you're on your watercolour journey and are looking for a bit more insight into certain processes. The tutorial after this hopefully will be considerably more expressive as I paint an eye in my more usual style, and I think it will be really interesting to see the difference in the process as well as the final outcome. If you've made it this far, congratulations for having a good attention span, and thank you so much for watching. Hopefully I will see you again soon.